we've never been really clear about what the difference is between different types of doctoral programs. And I think that's created some consternation and concern in some ways. And so I think it's useful and really important as a learning exercise for the institution to spend a little bit of time thinking about what that is. As I was saying, one of the concerns or one of the challenges is that we need to have a pretty clear idea about what the differences are between, say, the more traditional PhD itself and what a professional doctorate might be about. And I'll tell you at one level why this is very timely. The point is there is supposed to be a difference, and that is actually something that hasn't been very clear. There is a clear, in fact, not only just by size of project. At a really simple level, a PhD is up to 100,000 words of academic writing. A professional doctorate in that sense is really about 60,000 words of academic writing. And so there is quite, in that sense, quite a differential between the nature of the project. But where the real difference turns, and this is the most important part of it, is a fundamental understanding of what is meant by contribution. And it is really important that both supervisors and students have a clear idea about how this idea of contribution shifts and changes between the two projects. The second thing that's important, so we'll come back and talk about contribution in a moment. The second thing I think is important is about the object of the study. Now that relates a little bit to contribution, of course, but there is certainly a different focus in the sense that a PhD is much more about the object being a development of existing literatures, theories, methodologies, etc. Whereas there is a slightly different focus as an object of the professional doctorate, which is often outward focused, outward looking, and often to different stakeholder groups. So it could be to business practice, it could be to administration as practice, it could be into health as practice, depending on whatever professional doctorate program you're involved in, for example. But certainly there is a different object. And that possibly means that you've got to be careful about the way that you communicate. The nature of communication may well be different. Because, of course, one of the problems is if you write in horrible academic-ese, you know, if you're looking at the profession, if you're looking at users, if you have a stakeholder focus in the thesis itself, then you can lose people very quickly by getting caught in deep academic language at one level. But of course, I'm not saying it's not an academic project. It clearly is, and it clearly has to be au fait and comfortable and clearly articulated within and situated within existing bodies of knowledge as well. And so it's actually playing quite a difficult game between who and how you're communicating, because you're communicating between different groups at the same particular point in time. And so two things about that more generally. This is an AQF level 10 project irrespective. Right, so PhD is level 10, professional doctorate is level 10. It's the highest level available. And in fact, the AQF level 10 makes almost no distinction. There's only one paragraph which actually mentions something to do with the professional doctorate, and it actually isn't very helpful. So that also suggests that there's not a particularly clear articulation in terms of the AQF itself about what the differences are. And the Australian Qualifications Framework.
Which is government policy, basically. But that's also an issue with students and supervisors, some of whom see a professional doctorate as not being quite a PhD, whereas as far as the Australian government is concerned, it is. It's just different. And that's also an issue for some students who are enrolled in a professional doctorate and want to change to a PhD. It's the correct enrolment depends on so it's not like you're doing well, therefore you should change to a PhD. It's a case of, is this a type of a professional doctorate type project?
So do you mean whether it's going to have an industry focus as opposed to a theoretical contribution, or?
So I think it turns on the question of contribution,
right,
which we highlighted, but we haven't talked about yet.
Okay.
So I think it's a good idea that we talk a little bit about what that means. Now, I don't really want to sort of dictate what that is. I mean, I have my own ideas about it, but I think it's worth us sort of, I suppose, spending a little bit of time detailing what the differences might be around contribution. If I was going to say contribution, we've had a few ideas about it. What does that mean to us more generally in terms of a doctoral thesis? What does the concept of contribution mean? And it is, at the end of the day, the most important measure of the exercise at the doctoral level, that you should demonstrate contribution. What do we mean by that? A very traditional measure of a PhD was that it was an original contribution to knowledge, which I think has been watered down a little bit over the last 20 or 30 years, partly because that's an incredibly high level. What constitutes an original contribution has actually always been a difficult thing to judge, but certainly this idea about knowledge gaps. How do we identify knowledge gaps? Knowledge gaps in what areas? Literature, great. All right, so it's a contribution to a gap in literature, and I hear a lot of students articulating that I've got to find the gap in the literature. This is the gap in the literature, but there might be almost too much focus on finding gaps in literature at times, but yeah, that's one way of looking at it. So a literature gap. So it could be theory development, which would be addition and changes to existing theoretical frameworks, or it could be an application, maybe interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary, of an existing theory into a new space. So, for example, in my thesis, I took a theory of politics and applied it into how accounting and law work together. That was the first time that had been done, that sort of contribution. And it could be some sort of model application, so the development of a new model or the application, and I think also to some changes. I think this idea of pure replication can be a bit problematic here, but changing potentially for different structural or situationally specific issues around a model, I think, is certainly a measure of contribution. And there is at least one further, which is around methodology. So it could be a methodological contribution, either development of a new methodological approach, and that's probably the combination of method and analytical techniques, or it could be the application of a technique from another discipline into a new discipline, and seeing how that might work and change. So the idea is that there's going to be, and that's at the PhD level, there's going to be significant reflection on one or some of those levels. And I think one of those ideas is a reflexive exercise. It is a process of reflexivity to be able to say this is what's changed and developed. This is what's new, although I find new quite a complex idea myself, but what's changed or what might be important about this contribution. So we're really good at that. What about a professional doctorate, though? There are a difference between, say, a consultancy and still making it a doctoral program. That's important. And so the idea, we talked about identifying problems and seeking solutions and making recommendations. That's an interesting challenge. The second part of this, I suppose, is that the contribution measure is a contribution to practice. That you make a demonstrable contribution to practice. So I think there's 2 or 3 tensions to think about here at the moment, and I think this is really a useful conversation at the moment. The 2 or 3 tensions that arise is about, as my good friend has suggested, the difference between a research project and a consultancy. That is, I think, a relevant question to think about. There is a challenge around research philosophy. And there's a challenge around how you fit into and around sort of paradigmatic approaches to research. There's also a challenge around situation, and I mean situations and literatures, how you situate yourself, how you fit within literatures, how you fit within theories, how you fit within methodologies. So those things are also part of the challenge. And so I just want to maybe work through some of those things in turn, if that's okay.
A lot of professional doctorate students, they're not planning on becoming academics, and they they have a job in which there's this problem that can't be solved easily, and they want to go and have time to do research into it and that sort of thing, and go back and then maybe in later life, you know, they have a solution, maybe try and implement it in the workplace or something like that.
And the challenges, and this is where a number of students that I've been involved with as professional doctorates have often not necessarily struggled but found challenging, which is about tying together the problem, so this research challenge, this problem, and that's always an interesting thing to ask about. Why is this a problem? And what makes it a research problem? Those are two really interesting and useful things to think through. And then how you marry that to best practice, best ideas within the existing academic literature. That's the hard challenge, because, say, a research consultancy wouldn't necessarily go through all of those levels. So if I wanted to look at how do I improve product performance, or how do I more successfully market this product, or how do I I'm running out of ideas now, but
It doesn't ask the why question.
Yeah, there's no deeper why, and so the point is that I don't necessarily have to go to a really sort of deep reading of existing theoretical and other literature in order to answer the problem. So, for example, I know that I can pick up a standard marketing textbook and find that there'll be 5 or 6 things that you would normally do to improve product sales, and that's done. But that's not research based. Right, that's a problem which is solved. So the idea is it does have a broader question about it, which is that this is a problem which might exist in multiple organisations. So it's context specific, but it might have a broader application. But it requires that articulation and understanding of a broader range of literatures in order to provide potential recommendations to the problem itself. So it is a question of scope, I suppose. So anything that has kind of like, I'm just trying to improve profit, or I'm just trying to improve the bottom line, probably isn't a research problem in the sense of a doctorate project. I think what's important here to some degree is that certain groups of disciplines also need to get together and work out what these things mean. So, there's obviously lots of people in business doing professional doctorates. There are lots of people in administration doing professional doctorates, or public policy, etc. It's quite often useful if these groups meet together regularly to make sure they've got a clear idea of what the outputs are, and what the measure is of that logic of a contribution to practice itself. There is a line to draw between the extent of research required to do it. And if I can just pick up a text and answer the problem, or I can do a very quick survey of the internet and answer the problem, then it's probably not of scope to make it a professional doctorate. So they are significant problems in practice. They might be significant problems around professionalisation. There might be significant problems around coherency. There might be significant problems around communication, but they're significant problems for different practice groups, rather than purely solving this issue that the organisation has at this moment. And so I've seen 2 or 3 professional doctorates where I've been asked to examine them, and I've gone, this is a consultancy. This is a consultancy project, because it wasn't well situated in literature. It didn't have a paradigmatic lens through it. It didn't have any kind of advanced methodology. It had very simplistic levels of those things, and that became, because it is still supposed to be a significant contribution to practice, and that is it's a high bar. Any doctoral program is a high bar to meet, and so having a clear understanding of what that is important to have. The final thing is methodological sophistication, and this is often where I think the 2 biggest. I think these are actually 3 relevant challenges actually, but the 2 that I've examined which have not succeeded were both professional doctorates that had, I thought, very, very simplistic methodology. I'm going to do 100 surveys. I'm telling you descriptive statistics.
Right.
There wasn't anything at that kind of deeper level. Or I interviewed 5 people.
Yeah.
Well, that's fine, but where's the rest? And I mean, they've still got to be good research projects. I mean, if you had, say, an honours student or a master's student that came to you and said, I've got 5 interviews, you'd be like, well, that's not really enough. So this is an advanced level doctorate. You know, it's got to be still sophisticated in its methodology. And I think that the challenges for professional doctorate students are about each of those. And I think the biggest challenge is around the 3 challenges that I've always had in supervising professional doctorates are about using literature. So how do I use literature? So the combination of synthesis, summarization, and argument. Often it's used in a very descriptive format. I'm just going to use it. I'm just going to describe the literature. But that ability to drive an argument through literature is a skill that lots of research students struggle with, but particularly, I think, professional doctorate students. There is a big difference. And I had this trouble myself. I came from practicing law for 10 years, and everyone tells me when they read my writing that I write like a lawyer, still. And so the challenge between coming out of a professional environment and learning how to write in an academic way, but still being able to show professional application, that's a big challenge. And so one of those is about how you use literature. How do you summarize, synthesize, and argue through literature? And this is where you often see the problems, because students will go, here's 10 articles, here's the gap. And it's like, well, actually, that's not an argued gap, that's just a stated gap. And you kind of, why is that a gap? That's the big challenge. Finding yourself in and amongst academic language like paradigms, that is hard. It's hard for all students. It's very hard if you've come out of a very pragmatic, functional environment such as business or working in the public sector or wherever, or health or wherever you've been, for example. That's a big, or in education, it's a big challenge to then suddenly move back into the kind of implications of certain choices around knowledge, how you know things, where they come from, etc. That's hard. Then having, particularly around methodology, having some idea about analysis, that's actually really hard. People come, in business or in most institutions, people will have done research projects, but they're at that very simple level of let's survey 100 people. I mean, you would have seen sort of the kind of results that people publish on television around different health products. 7 out of 10 Australians think this is, the world's best thing for eradicating whatever it happens to be at this problem time. But that's not a sophisticated study. That's the problem. People come in with an assumption they know what research is. And then we come in and say, well, actually, there's this whole other set of assumptions behind it. And to some degree, we might reinforce that a little bit, because we say to people, well, there's quant research and qual research, and we almost reinforce that a little bit. Because actually it's a much more deeper understanding of how and why you might use different information sources for the types of issues you're trying to deal with. Context is clearly important. I think the real challenges come when people go, I need to use mixed methodology, which is a term that I find generally problematic, but that's another point. But they use the term because they think they need to, not because it really makes... So they want to get a little bit of this and they want to get a little bit of that, but they're not really sure about why they're doing both. That's the idea. That's where it becomes more challenging. Right. So I don't think any approach to methodology necessarily is problematic for a professional doctorate because you're using it for a purpose. One of the challenges might be that pure methods in the positivist framework are often difficult to explain in a practical space. So if I have a really highly articulated, say, regression, it's very difficult often to be able to explain how that actually implicates particular parts of practice itself. It might do, but it often can be difficult. And so the 3 or 4 professional doctorates that I've supervised successfully have all been in a qualitative space. Because often it's getting to often it's about kind of challenges around organisational hierarchies, it's around practices, it's around traditions, and you're trying to find ways of changing or shifting cultures. And that's often quite, so particularly things like change management, that sort of often leads itself to really useful sort of qualitative work, in-depth understandings of the environment, rather than kind of necessarily surface-level explanation. I said I was going to say about context. Context is desperately important in here, but it is, I think, one of the hardest chapters to write in a professional doctorate. The great risk is to write them descriptively, and that's what people do. They'll write a context chapter purely descriptively, and the problem with that is that the measure of almost all HDR work is it has to be analytical. And so how do you make context analytical? Bringing in literatures, perhaps bringing in theoretical frameworks into that to try to read that context is really important. But also, you have to take your examiner with you. I'm in this context. This is what this is about. I'm applying these in this context. And so that's also really important in the literature elements of the thesis, by able to, how this context of this research, of this literature is different to my context. So almost that the way that I explain it to students is how I'd explain legal precedent. So legal precedent works on the basis of, so you look for the key element of the literature. What's the key argument, key finding, which is in a legal sense, the key part of the case. What's the key decision? How is the factual environment of that research similar or different to my particular context? And being really careful in articulating. So this comes out of this space. My research problem is based in this type of context. This raises 2 or 3 different issues that we need to think about. And being really clear about identifying the context of the literature versus the context of your study. And being able to draw out the differences to carry the reader, the examiner or the reader with you. So it's 2 or 3, and hence things like chapter summaries are really important here. This literature is really useful, but there are 3 or 4 things contextually that were left out. That this, and this, and that's what we need to investigate further with the study, because that's how we can find a solution or a recommendation or a new way of thinking about this particular contextual problem that this professional doctorate is based in. That's really important in the doctorate process. So one of the key differences is actually context, because it is a professional. It's a contribution to professional practice, but in our context. So they are contextually bound. Yes, absolutely. So, for example, that makes other things really difficult. So generalizability, really difficult. If that is a measure of impact, if that's a measure paradigmatically of impact, which it certainly is in positivism, very difficult to make generalizable claims here, because it is so contextually specific. That's why I think potentially something like the kind of qualitative interpretive, perhaps interpretive critical space is a little bit easier to make the contribution, because you're not trying to seek the universal, because these aren't universal contexts, they are actually really particular contexts. And I think you have to deal quite carefully with that tension if you're going down more traditional positivistic techniques. So these are certain of those challenges at times that you might need to think through in that project. It is actually, it is a doctorate. That's really important. It is a doctorate. And it's not a second class, it's not a lower class exercise. It is, according to the Australian government, exactly the same. It gives you all the same rights, all the same benefits,